I'm Sophie Volp. I'm chair of the Center for Chinese Studies, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to this year's Elvira Guangxiam Lim Memorial Lecture in Chinese Studies. This endowed lecture series was made possible through a generous gift to the center by Mrs. Lim's family to honor her dedication to scholarly exchange. With this endowment, we bring one eminent scholar to Berkeley each fall to present a public lecture and meet with faculty, grad students, and debate among colleagues. The namesake of this series, Elvira Lim, was born in Guangdong Province in 1928. She was sent to Hong Kong to attend high school and later received her undergraduate degree from the University of Hong Kong. After receiving her PhD from the University of Hawaii, Mrs. Lim took a position in the biology department of the newly established Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she remained until her retirement in 1989. We are thrilled that her nephews, Richard and Ulysses, can be with us today. And Richard actually just shared a memory of going to visit her labs in the Chinese University, and also of her collaborating with colleagues here at Berkeley. So it's very, very special that we can do this here today. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Peter Perdue of Yale. Peter's research covers modern Chinese and Japanese social and economic history, the history of frontiers, and world history. He's also written on grain markets in China, agricultural development, and environmental history. Peter's the author of Exhausting the Earth, State and Peasant in Hunan, 1500 to 1850 AD, and China Marches West, the Qing Conquest of Central Eurasia, which won the 2006 Joseph Levinson Prize from the Association for Asian Studies, which is given to the best book each year in pre-modern Chinese studies. Peter was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2007. He's the co-editor of two books on empires, Imperial Formations and Shared Histories of Modernity. He's also the co-author of Global Connections, a world history textbook, and Asia Inside Out, 3 volumes on inter-Asian connections. And he has also recently published lectures on Chinese environmental history in Chinese. His current research focuses on Chinese frontiers, Chinese environmental history, and the history of tea. So thank you very much, Peter, for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Wenxin and Sophie, for the invitation to be here. It's wonderful to be in California this time of year. And thank you all for coming to listen to this somewhat new experimental topic that I've been looking into recently. So most of my previous work has been on the Qing dynasty in the 17th and 18th centuries, but now I've become interested in the last decade of the Qing dynasty from 1900 to 1912, which was also, of course, the first decade of the 20th century. How did Qing China and the Chinese people participate actively in the shaping of the 20th century? Qing China lasted into the 20th century. Some people need to be reminded of that. Sometimes we only see China as just a victim of imperialism in this whole period of the so-called period of humiliation in the 19th and early 20th century. But there's a lot more to this story than that. And that's part of what I've been exploring recently. So this is a kind of new topic for me, but I thought you might find some interesting insights in it. And this is just a rough outline of what I'll talk about quickly today. The global moment of 1900 and why I think it mattered around the world and why China was important in it. The Paris Exposition, which occurred in the early part of the year, that gathered imperial powers together in a glittering display. The anarchist response, the dark side of the story, which also occurred around the same time in Paris and China and many other cities around the world. And then Beijing in 1900, the later part of the year, when the 8 imperial armies invaded the city and repressed the Boxer Uprising and lifted the siege of the foreign legations, and looting and confinement and repression followed. And then debates over these issues and events that occurred both in Europe and America and Asia around the same time. So there are many different threads to this story and many different voices, and these are only just a few of them, but that's a brief sketch of what I'll be talking about today. I want to begin with a song that introduces one of the main themes of this talk.
Und der Haifisch, der hat Zähne und die trägt er im Gesicht. Und McKeith, der hat ein Messer, doch das Messer sieht man nicht. An dem schönen blauen Sonntag liegt ein toter Mann am Strand und ein Mensch geht um die Ecke, den man Messer nennt.
Well, many of you probably know that song, maybe in different versions. Mac the Knife, as it's known in English. And the last stanza, it was composed by Kurt Weill, the song, who was actually born in the year 1900. The words were written by Bertolt Brecht. It appears in 1928 in their Threepenny Opera. It describes the entire series of grotesque crimes of murder and arson and rape in which Mackie Messer, Mac the Knife, is often implicated but never gets caught. And in the last stanza of the song, it goes like this. There are some who are in darkness and others who are in light, and you see the ones in brightness and those in darkness drop from sight. Und dann die einen sind im Dunkel und die anderen sind im Licht. Und man sieht die im Lichte, die im Dunkel sieht man nicht. So light and darkness is part of the theme of this story. Weill was born in 1900, lived through the early 20th century in Weimar, and exposed this contrast between the glittering spectacles of industrial and imperial capitalism that he saw around him and the grinding misery of people who lived in the darkness of poverty and colonialism and the activists who were trying to end it. We can also note, from a different standpoint, a statistical standpoint, what inequality was like in this period of 1900. This is a graph of roughly calculating the inequality, economic inequality in Europe, all the way from the end of the Roman Empire, as you see, to the year 2000. And as you can see on this map, inequality rises and reaches a peak just about around 1900, right here. And then what's called the Great Compression occurs. Inequality drops radically after the Great Depression and the post-war years of welfare states. And I think, as you're aware, since 1980 and 2000, inequality has been very rapid and on the rise. Anyone who knows San Francisco real estate prices is aware of that, I'm sure. But this is true everywhere. And some people even think our rates of inequality are back to where they were in the Gilded Age of 1900. So this is partly a lecture about inequality, about some people who live in glittering spectacles and other people who live in misery, and how the Chinese are connected to all of this. In the two big contrasts of 1900 that reveal this very starkly are the Paris Exposition of the early part of 1900 and the Boxer Expedition in Beijing later on. In the Paris Exposition, which was held from April 14th to November 12th, the major powers, the imperial powers led by France, celebrated their economic, technological, and cultural achievements and boasted about their colonial possessions. In Beijing, from June 20 to August 15th, 8 of these same powers mobilized armies to lift the siege of the foreign legations, violently repressing the resistance of the Qing army and its mobilized peasant militia, so-called Boxers. Executions, rapes, and looting followed. Both attracted great global media attention at the time, dominated much of the news for that year, and then faded away. But they both left a significant legacy, and they really symbolized the chief phenomenon of the coming century, the 20th century. The first, imperialist violence, and second, the spectacles of global capitalism. So Shifting a bit to methodology quickly, many historians have argued that we should shift the focus of our research away from just a single nation state. We should try to construct other narratives that try to engage with a globalizing world. Many people have advocated this. Many people have written world histories about this. But one other way to do it, there are many different ways to approach this question, is to focus on the events of a single year or a short period of time and try to track the threads that link the events in one place to the events in some other places around the world. This is a quotation here of what I would like to do from a great book by a Dutch historian who wrote about Europe in 1900. Look at this infinite series of microprocesses that prompt the macro processes that give this great historical drama, and how traditional forms of domination transformed into modern imperialism. Classical capitalism became banking and monopoly capitalism, and the masses for the first time joined in with national movements to play an active role in world developments. That's a brief sketch of how he tries to connect at least Europe in this year, and I think we can extend that to other parts of the world. We have tried to do a bit of this in a series of volumes called Asia Inside Out, a 3-volume series that tries to connect different parts of Asia together in many different time periods. In the first volume, Changing Times, we had a series of authors and we asked them to pick a crucial year that they thought mattered for their part of the world, whether it was India or the Middle East or China or Japan. They all picked some very interesting years. We had them pick a place in the second volume and people in the third volume. So this sort of approach of picking a particular focus through a year, a place, or a person is something that I think can be usefully extended and used to write these new transnational and global history narratives. Well, the year 1900 had significance not just in Paris and Beijing, but in much of the rest of the world. The great major imperial powers gathered together in these two places in 1900, but many of other people gathered there alongside them. There were anarchists, there were militarists, there were businessmen, there were political activists, there were intellectuals who all went off to change the world in many other places. And this was the same year, around this time, that the British were combating the Boer farmers, the Dutch farmers in South Africa. The US was repressing the guerrilla movement, resisting the US takeover of the Philippines. Anarchists, who ranged all the way from peaceful dreamers to violent revolutionaries, were a constant threat and inspiration around the world. They had assassinated the president of France, Sadi Carnot, in 1894, King Umberto of Italy in 1900, President McKinley in 1901, and over 30 high Russian officials from 1881 to 1911. So the anarchists were this other side of the glittering spectacle, this loose network of people spanning Eurasia and the Americas, the terrifying threat of the year, of the age, that ruling elites and others talked about incessantly, as well as oppressed peoples who were inspired by anarchist activities in many parts of the world, everywhere from Spain to China. On the other side, you had global arms salesmen, for example, fueling the arms race by the great powers. Germany was trying to find a place in the sun. Germany was the rising power of the time. Germany was also spurred on by the rise of Japan in the East. You may have heard of Kaiser Wilhelm and his fantasies and predictions about the yellow peril of that time. The country he had in mind at the time as the rising yellow peril was in fact Japan. Later, this was attached to China. So these ideas of Oriental racism and the idea of rising powers in the East combated by rising powers in the West were all part of the discourse of the time. Chinese who were immigrants in the US, particularly in San Francisco, were victims of much of this racist discourse as well. I'll show you a few rather upsetting pictures about that, just so you are aware that they were part of this whole story. The imagery of Christian martyrdom in China generated these calls for violent acts of repression and revenge against the Chinese. But on the other side of the story, we flip back from dark to light. This was also a period of holding great peace conferences, the Hague Peace Conference, that tried to establish treaty regimes to replace warfare. It was the holding of the Second Olympics in Paris after the first one in Athens 4 years before that. The creation of international time zones is a very interesting product of this period as well, to standardize and globalize the way people think about time, and other appeals to international cooperation of many kinds. So we have contrasting trends throughout, running through this whole period. The global media exposed all of these threads at the time. So mostly what I've been doing is reading a lot of the global media of the time, and particularly the illustrated media, and how the imagery of the time has spread many of these ideas, which of course spread well beyond the literate public into other aspects of public opinion throughout the world. This is a time of explosion of global media, really. And this is the website we've done at MIT to track many developments about East-West contact by looking at specific events through visual imagery. And we use global media, photography, paintings, and other things to portray these important events in Asia through visual means. So here, I'll just give you a few slides to give you an example of this dazzling kaleidoscope that you get when you track the whole clashing and connection of many different kind of illustrated media following these events around the world. Well, how did China figure in these events? But briefly, there are three different ways I'll talk about how China was involved. First, China, particularly Beijing, is this massive site, a place of imperial and national contestation, the home of the great empire that all the great powers are competing to gain influence on. Second, the Chinese people themselves, who are located not just in China itself, of course, but as migrants have been established in many parts of the world, particularly Southeast Asia and the Americas. And third, China as a sign, China as a kind of traveling signifier for general concerns of other nations of the world. Often the actual China on the ground, or in real Chinese people, becomes detached from what they really were and travels around the world in this stereotypical kind of depiction that then affects the way other people look at the Chinese in many places. There are many works on global history of this period. You might even go back to Lenin and the writers on imperialism of the early 20th century, but they mostly have in common the fact that they stress almost exclusively the domination of Europe and then the US in driving events of the period. And I think it's time that we recenter this story somewhat and pay more attention to developments in Asia. So beginning with the Paris Exposition, which ran from April to November, the Exposition Universelle in Paris. It was the fifth of the expositions held in Paris, the fifth and the last one, and it was designed to celebrate the advance of human civilization and the unity of nations. These expositions had been held in a whole series of European cities. These were kind of fleeting cities that began with the great London exhibition of 1851, which was the great Crystal Palace, the exposure of all the achievements of Victorian Britain. That was followed by the French, who wanted to celebrate their achievements under Louis Napoleon II in 1855. Others followed in other countries. The most famous one in the US was in Philadelphia in 1876. The Great Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, and not to be outdone, the Germans had their first in Berlin in 1896. So often these expositions were held on a canonical date, an anniversary of the nation that held it. The 100th anniversary of the American Revolution, the 400th anniversary, 1 year late, of Columbus's so-called discovery of America, the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution in 1889. So they're not just celebrating international achievement, they actually are closely tied to the celebration of a nation state in their place that they're located. The International Olympics today as well is still the classic kind of example of a place that purports and does in some ways celebrate international cooperation, but at the same time is, of course, intensely nationalistic when all the competitors are identified by their nation. That's where this whole phenomenon began. The 1900 Expo stands out really as the peak for attendance at these expositions. There were something like 50 million people attended, and for that population at that time, it was enormous. And that actual total figure was not surpassed until the 1960s. But these have gone on ever since, of course, and the great Shanghai Expo of 2010, which followed the Beijing Olympics of 2008, really follows in this same tradition of, on the one hand, putting on a display of international achievements alongside the celebration of a rising new power. Well, France, however, was not actually a rising power in 1900, and there's another side to the exposition that's in the commentary at the time. Many people saw it as a nation in decline. Its population had hardly grown. It had about 40 million people. Germany had about 70 million after unification in 1870. Germany was growing at double the rate of France. The French had lost the war to Germany in 1870. Germany was rising. France seemed to be stagnating or declining. Germany was turning towards arms manufacture and major industrial production around this time, and a major naval building campaign trying to rival that of Britain. And meanwhile, in France, the Dreyfus Affair was tearing the country apart. This is an American cartoon that says, "Will she be rescued?" And she is the woman draped in the robe that says the French Republic here, held in this beast who has the cap that says militarism, and J'accuse here, the famous article by Émile Zola here, and forgery here, and blackmail here, a sort of polarized French society about this case of the Jewish officer Dreyfus and whether or not he was guilty or innocent. He'd been in prison for life since 1894. Émile Zola published this Declaration J'accuse in 1898 to launch this campaign to hold a second trial. The military, the aristocracy, and the church lined up against Dreyfus, and the intelligentsia and the liberal secular bourgeoisie supported him. France was torn apart by this. A second trial was held in 1899. Dreyfus was found guilty again, but his sentence was reduced to 10 years in prison. But planning the global exposition of 1900, the French realized they would face a global boycott if they didn't do something about this Dreyfus case. So they actually pressed the French president to pardon him, and they got most of the French media to agree to not mention the Dreyfus affair during the time of the exposition. The media was more under control of the state in those days than it is these days, clearly. So they got the major nations of the world to stake out territory, and Dreyfus was declared innocent eventually in 1906. So they could move on to the exposition, and this is where it was held, 550 acres along the Seine, with French pavilions devoted to the advance of industry and the arts. 47 nations had their own pavilions, big halls celebrating industry, technology, and communication. There were new technological marvels, which included early motion pictures, electric lighting, moving sidewalks, a Ferris wheel, diesel engines, and the first audio recorder. And the great symbolic center of the whole exhibition was the Palais de l'Électricité. This was the age of electricity, which lit up this enormous building with all sorts of lights. A cathedral in honor of electric power, really. And the lights run all along the length of the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower had been built for the previous exposition in 1899, but without lights. Now you could light the whole thing up. There were palaces of education, science, letters. They lit up an Egyptian temple, Japanese gardens, models of great lighthouses of the world, 5,000 light bulbs in the Palace of Electricity alone, 10,000 more in the buildings around it. The scale is colossal and exceeds everything that had been done before. Americans who went to France to be part of the exposition celebrated all of this as being great for business, a way to overcome all the animosities of the world and collect all the peoples of the world together to do peaceful business. It was still a time when Paris dominated world culture. The style of Art Nouveau was introduced here, and it became this universal form. Something else I'd like to track some at some time how Art Nouveau and these artistic styles spread all the way around the world to the US, to Japan, and as far as Shanghai. A great excuse to go to cities and museums and track down all the Art Nouveau interests. Which if you've been to Shanghai, you can find traces being restored, in fact, today. But there's all sorts of interesting styles mixed together at the exposition, not really a consistent one. The person who designed these pavilions, for example, the Bosnian pavilions, was named Alphonse Mucha. He was a Czech graphic artist. He had made the posters that I showed you before. There's a great exhibit of his work in Prague. He was an international artist celebrating here ominously the city of Sarajevo, which later became famous for other things. But Mucha was not only an international graphic artist, but a fervent Czech nationalist. So he also combines in himself and in his art these sort of dual aspects of the international exposition display as well as the dedication to nationalistic production. However, if you look at critics and discussions of the exposition, there were many people who were disappointed with the technology on display. The Eiffel Tower was certainly there. It was still very impressive, but Germany seemed to have surpassed France in its technology. Even in the arts, it looked like Japanese craftsmanship was really advancing and becoming more interesting and developed than France. The American historian Henry Adams, who was very impressed by the power of the dynamo that he had seen in the Chicago Exposition. It was really the key foundation of the exposition were the actual dynamos, the machines that drove the electric power that powered the entire exhibition. And you could go visit them and hear them thrumming along, producing all this great power. Adams visited this and concluded that this was impressive technologically, but morally empty. He would sit by the hour over the great dynamos, watching them run noiselessly and smoothly as planets, and asking them with infinite courtesy where the hell they are going. They are marvelous. The gods are not in it, chiefly the Germans. So this had technology, it had industry, it had its products for middle-class consumers, but not necessarily progress morally or aesthetically, and there were premonitions of decline and loss of purpose. It seemed like France had a weakened, decadent culture, while Germany and America had power without culture. But the imperial powers were celebrating the productions and control over their colonies. So this was the colonial district where the French featured very heavily with their entire Indochina exhibition over here. The British get their colonies up there. The Netherlands have theirs here, and China is here, interesting, in the colonial exhibition, next to Siberia here, Portugal up here, and the Transvaal of South Africa up here. Interesting juxtaposition there. So France is able to show off a plaster model of Angkor Wat, the great temple of Cambodia, to show that they have preserved and dominated Asian culture here. Japan can show off a great exhibition of its newly acquired quasi-colony, Korea. You could go to places like the mock Tunisian Bazaar, where you could smoke the nargile pipe and watch the belly dancers in Tonkinese villages. You can watch women chewing the betel nut in a village, an African village. Quote from one observer, "Great Negroes, still savages, strode barefoot with proud and rhythmic bearing, while their wives pounded millet and peanuts, and there you heard the scraping of Chinese violins, the click of castanets, the thin wail of Arab flutes, and the mystic screeches of the Aisau." So the racist writing of this period is quite extraordinary. And perhaps I should deliver trigger warnings to people that this is indeed offensive from our point of view. But this is how things were portrayed at the time. The Chinese buildings were, as I said, in the colonial district over there, within this area, next to Siberia and the Transvaal, as a quasi-colony, you could say. Not a true colony, but not truly independent either. The main building is a great pavilion in imperial style, which says, according to this guide, It reproduces the well-known monuments of the Celestial Empire with pavilions and pagodas, a Chinese restaurant, a theater, a famous gate of the Temple of Confucius, the humpback bridge of the Summer Palace, the Russian Gate with the inscription in 10 languages, one of which has never been deciphered until this day. So that is the mystery and exoticism and impressive imperial China. The idealist China of splendor and refined postures. As in this picture, you can see the fake Chinese people down here, including the sedan chairs and the robes and the queue and the Buddha, Buddhist gods. You got everything in there. This is a photograph of the great imperial pavilion that was there. This is the gate that's set up in front of the exhibit. And here you can see a 3D version of this that's been done in this project in Paris. So that comes from an amazing French project that really is tracking Paris in 3D over the history, and they've done an amazing job of reconstructing through old maps the buildings of the time. And everything that was built for the exposition was done in plaster and wood and torn down when it was all over. So now, even though the exposition is gone, you can virtually reconstruct basically all the buildings that were there all throughout Paris at the time. It's all about prosperity, it's about capitalism. In American writing, it's certainly all about the great abundance of American agriculture that can feed the world and how the US is rising as this great capitalist production area, and that in turn will bring peace to the world. But there were also real Chinese at the exposition, and they were a little more troublesome because the large French Indochina exhibit, which had this replica of Angkor Wat, also brought in artisans from their colonies, and there were 53 Indo-Chinese masons, painters, and sculptors, and among them were several Han Chinese. They protested the level of their wages and the length of their working hours. The French regarded the Indo-Chinese natives, the Laotians, Cambodians, and Vietnamese, as very naive and simple and docile, but they were very suspicious of the Chinese. The Chinese had this reputation for being unruly and quarrelsome. And in the French newspaper, the Time, the Petit Journal, there's a report that these Chinese had mutinied, they'd staged a work stoppage, 17 of them had tied the manager to a pole in order to beat him, and the Chinese were sent home. So this all happened before the Boxer Uprising, but the French had already had in their mind this idea that, geez, Chinese laborers somehow are not being as docile as they're supposed to be as colonial people. We can move on to some other not so docile responses to the capitalism of this time, in which eventually China is also involved. In 1894, this man, Émile Henry, set off a bomb at the Café Terminus, killing 1 person and wounding 20. And in the words of John Merriman, my colleague at Yale, he ignited the modern age of terror. And from the 1880s through the 1914, anarchists conducted violent attacks in at least 16 countries from Europe, North and South America, and Asia with this global vision that's transcended national boundaries. They weren't part of a single revolutionary party, but they responded to many of the same conditions everywhere. The deep poverty and despair of workers and farmers who were barely eking out a living in squalor. So for most French people, the Belle Époque was not very belle. It was very filled with misery, unemployment, and disease in the slums that surrounded the glittering areas of downtown Paris. There were shocking inequalities there. And in his speech, when Henri was brought before the court, he openly denounced the frauds, the lies and imposters, the manufacturers who created colossal fortunes out of the toil of workers, the deputies and the ministers who were ever open for bribes. It all revolted him. This is what attracted him to become a critic of the existing social organization. I became an enemy of a society that I judged to be criminal. Well, this is typical and a widespread sentiment of the people who are trying to attack the inequality and fraudulence and corruption of their time through violence or not through violence. This man has an interesting story to tell also, and this in the issue of the Revolutionary Chinese Journal called Minbao, which was published by Chinese exiles in Japan in 1907, is a picture of this man. This comes from an American journal, but the same picture was taken from the American magazine and reprinted in Minbao. His name was Gregory Gershuni. He was in 1901 the founder, one of them, of the Russian Social Revolutionary Party, which had dedicated itself to violent overthrow of the Tsarist regime. And they had assassinated 2 high-ranking Russian officials. Then he was sent to prison in Siberia in 1903. He escaped by concealing himself in a barrel of sauerkraut, after which he made his way across Manchuria to Japan. In Japan, he met Sun Yat-sen, who had also fled to exile from the Qing state. And from Japan, he made it to the United States, and where he gave lectures about his revolutionary life. And then this photo, which was put up to advertise his lectures, made its way back to Minbao on the telegraph wires. And in Minbao, there's a whole series of photos and articles celebrating the great revolutionaries of the world. And they extend all the way from the French revolutionaries, the Jacobins, to the Filipino rebels like Aguinaldo, to anarchists of all kinds. So this is the discourse of the Chinese revolutionaries in exile in Japan, which makes its way back through student circles and military circles into China. So that's just one more example of how this anarchist movement also has a global reach, like the exposition of the other side, and people were spread all over the world. One more example of sort of interlocking connections here comes from these 2 men. It's kind of hard to tell them apart, actually. They almost look the same. Okakura Tenshin on the left and Kotoko Shusui on the right, as you see, lived roughly about the same time. They were both Japanese intellectuals and writers with very different experiences. You may know Okakura Tenshin, or Kakura Kakuzo, is the author of the very famous Book of Tea, who argued for the unity of Asia and the cultural achievements of Japan. But Kotoko Shusui on the right is less well known. He was an anarchist, radical, who translated the Communist Manifesto into Japanese and founded the Japanese Social Democratic Party, published a book in 1901 entitled Imperialism, which is a systematic denunciation of Western imperialism as the monster of the 20th century. And this tract, which was published in 1901, came 1 year before the most famous book on imperialism of the time, that is by Hobson, the British writer, also entitled Imperialism. And about 10 years before Lenin, who really copied from Hobson, published the classic Marxist-Leninist analysis of imperialism. So Kotoko was the first, really, to publish this systematic analysis of imperialism as a social and political form. He was at first a Japanese nationalist, and he had praised Japan's participation in the suppression of the Boxers. He thought the Chinese were primitive bandits and thought that Japan was the most westernized power in Asia and it could be a model for China. But later, he denounced the Japanese government for joining with Western powers in looting, raping, and killing Chinese, and embraced a much more cosmopolitan, anti-imperialist view, and openly denounced this whole scandal of the looting of China by Japanese and foreign troops, and attacked the corruption of the Japanese military, and explicitly referred to the Dreyfus affair as a compelling example of the corruption that military interference in politics causes in the life of civil society. The public could hardly help but wonder whether the top command of the French army was filled with knaves and fools. So the Dreyfus affair had implications globally for other analysts of the world. This was not really an analysis of the economic structure of capitalism. Unlike Hobson and Lenin, it's really a moral critique that blames imperialist war on animalistic primitivism. And it really is echoed more by, say, Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote on imperialism in 1919 as an atavistic, primitivist urge rather than a rational economic analysis. Yet Kotoku was remarkably insightful that this whole imperialist competition was a fundamental threat to world peace. And he had seen it happen in Beijing in 1900 and other places in South Africa and the Philippines, Germany and Shandong, Russia, France, and Italy, and predicted World War would come, this in 1902. Okakura Tenshin, I'll only briefly mention him, who became famous with his idea of Pan-Asianism in 1903, as the light of civilization, had a much lighter view of the world, a more sunny, optimistic view. He said, Asia is one. The Himalayas divide only to accentuate two mighty civilizations, the Chinese with its communism of Confucius and the Indian with its individualism of the Vedas. But there is a broad expanse of love for the ultimate and universal, which is the common thought inheritance of every Asiatic race, enabling them to produce all the great religions of the world. His even more famous Book of Tea, written in 1906, advocates Teaism as a philosophy of purity and harmony, the mystery of mutual charity, and the romanticism of the social order. So this is the other side of the Pan-Asian vision, where Okakura shared a great deal and had conversations with Rabindranath Tagore in India, that there would be this common ground between the Asian peoples who would lead the way to a peaceful world order. But clearly, Japan would be at the top. Japan would be the leading civilization in this Pan-Asian vision. Kotoku didn't give, by his contrast, his counterpart gave Japan no special credit. It was just as much a corrupt militarist dictatorship as anywhere else. But they shared actually certain things in common. They both believed that Asians and mobilized masses of Asians would somehow become the decisive players in the future of the world. They would be shaping the future of the 20th century, either as militarists or as Pan-Asianists or as civilizational leaders or as economic domination. So that's a few thoughts, a few threads of how anarchism leads to this sort of global critique and inspires Asian writers in many different places to try to grasp and predict how Asia will figure in the global world order. Let's go to Beijing now in 1900. Briefly, you are mostly probably familiar with this story, but I will just show you a few images about it. The Boxers, who were they? Well, they were a kind of peasant militia group who had flourished in China for a long, long time, who came from northwestern Shandong. And this was a village culture that celebrated through local folk operas, through martial artists, through celebration of local heroes, victories of the past in local theater performances. At the same time, the people themselves suffered from poverty and famine. In these village fairs, you can see martial artists sort of portraying their physical prowess here, fighting with each other, as well as you have gymnasts performing on tight ropes. And so it's all part of the village culture of Shandong at the time. Then Christian missionaries intrude into the Chinese countryside. The local Confucian elites get very upset about the presence of the Confucians. Here are some of the so-called Punch and Judy shows, theaters being performed in Chinese cities in the missionaries' point of view, boxers inciting the people to insurrection by Punch and Judy shows, and the missionary is represented by a pig. Of course, in Chinese, the idea of Tianzhu, that is Lord of Heaven, is a pun, a homonym with Tianzhu, the heavenly pig, and so there was often this combination of the pig with Jesus in these anti-Christian tracts that are put out by local gentry in opposition to Christian missionaries in the countryside. And we've collected a bunch of these and put them on the website, and there are all sorts of interesting things in here. But you see the sacrificed pig up here in front of an altar on the cross. You see the color green here. In Chinese, green is a symbol of cuckoldry. So you see these improper sexual relations going on between Western men and Chinese women here and Chinese men, all instigated by the Christians in this kind of anti-Christian literature. This war broke out, was portrayed as something of a war between civilization and barbarism. And as the Confucian pamphleteers argue, who are really the real savages here? The missionaries treat the Chinese as being unenlightened savages, but what about the missionaries and their Christian mass, which relies on consuming the blood of their god? And then the blood libel spreads among the Chinese population that actually Western missionaries are using the blood of Chinese children for their religious rituals. Once this spreads around the countryside, these groups that call themselves the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, Yihe Tren, start to combine these martial artists with these specialists in spirit possession, with these anti-Christian mobilizers, and wage this war against Christians who had disturbed the harmony of heaven and earth. And the main target is actually Chinese Christians who have converted. They take the mass brunt of the targetry of the Boxer militia. The foreign powers, of course, insisted that the Qing court repress these groups, but the court eventually decides to endorse them as legitimate militia, and they renamed the Yihe Tren, the Righteous Fists, as Yihe Tuan, the Righteous Militia, and enroll them, in effect, in the Qing army. And then the Boxers converge on Beijing and begin the siege of the foreign legations in June 20th. And the Empress Dowager declares war on the foreign powers, and the siege lasts the famous 55 days. There's a film about that with Charlton Heston, maybe a must viewing if you're interested in this topic. Nothing about the Chinese view in it, though. And during 55 days, the foreigners are besieged in these sites in the legation and the northern cathedral. So this is when imperial powers don't have Asian peoples under their control, as they did in the Paris Exposition. They are in China, coming into direct contact with Asian peoples where they don't control the government, and they don't have military force. They've lost control and they lack information, and horror stories are generated in the foreign press about victims of massacres, especially young children, who of course are the key way that the media whips up excitement about what's happening to foreigners in China. So there are these great fears of alien forces attacking the civilized West. There were heroic women prisoners, confined women. This is also common trope in Western commentary on China. They like to show this kind of thing ever since the Opium War days, that women under Chinese law are arrested and carried around in cages, so they think. And you can find these images in lots of the Western illustrated press. The Boxers, however, did much the same thing, you could say, in these Nianhua. These are the New Year's prints, where they celebrate a captured foreign officer here, whom they have hogtied and have him hanging from a pole here, and the Boxer peasantry are stabbing this guy here and carrying this guy to judgment under their flags to be brought before a local magistrate, and the foreigner here tied, bowing down, begging before the panel of judges here. So this is the Boxer view of what you do with foreigners through your legal means, by confining them and bringing them before a court. How do people talk about all this? There are many, many images of this. We collected something like 2,500 images, and there are far more, even more available. And so this is a very small selection of only a few types of this explosion of imagery that occurred at the time. How do people talk about it? Well, for Europeans and Americans, this was a defense of civilization. It was savagery versus civilization. You have Uncle Sam with his machine gun representing force if necessary, it says here, progress here, the Chinese dragon here, barbarians on the flag, China there. Someone must back up. That's the idea. There's this irresistible clash between progress and civilization. Here is the other side of the story, commerce and trade. Why the US have to take the Philippines? It's a stepping stone to China. And the US is bringing all of this industrial product, plus education and religion up there, along with steel rails and everything else, to these very happy Chinese who have wanted 50 million sewing machines, 50 million reaping machines, wanted waterworks, sewers, stoves, lamps, petroleum. So this is the other side of the Chinese market. We can sell things to them. They will be great. And that's why we need the Philippines to get into China. The whole debate about why or whether the US should take the Philippines or not is actually very closely tied to access to the China market. And the main argument is that by holding these colonies, the US will be able to feed its hungry children here. That says Pacific Coast right there, and it's bringing bags from Cuba up here, for example. The American Eagle bringing all these resources back to America from the trade with the new colonial possessions. Another example of why the US can't let go of the Philippines and it has to rescue it from the tigers of Aguinaldoism. He was the Filipino guerrilla leader, and this native-looking person is being rescued, in effect, by US victorious colonialism. And then the tie is made between the Boxers and the Philippines and the presidential election that McKinley ran against Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan, you may know, is this populist candidate who runs on a platform both of free silver, that is providing more monetary aid to farmers and others who are in debt across the Middle West, and anti-imperialism. But in the pro-imperialist press supporting McKinley, you have Bryan depicted as this idol, silver idol, being worshipped by these Oriental-looking people. And here he says, our democratic Boxers, Chinese are not the only barbarians who worship and fight for a false god. Again, the interconnection of all these imagery at the time is really quite remarkable and quite obvious once you start looking at it. We don't need to divide up history by national boundaries, and we can just follow what they say in the press at the time. Democratic Boxers, again, in a bad fix. Eventually, Bryan lost the election, of course. McKinley was elected and was assassinated 1 year later. Another side, however, there is a critical side to all of this, which brings us to the confinement side of the story again, exemplified by the use of barbed wire. So this is another thread, wire thread that we could follow, how barbed wire is first invented in the US as a remarkably efficient way of confining animals, because once animals are pricked by the barbs, they don't go near the fence again. And this is what makes possible the occupation of the American rangelands in the 19th century. But the British, fighting the Boer farmers in South Africa, discover you can also use it to fight and confine humans. And this is how the progress of science works from a French point of view. The British moving in and using these fences, fencing in other human beings. Then the confinement is then turned around against the British when there is commentary, even in America, about the British being tied down in South Africa and these battles that they fought and lost, that is the Boer Lilliputians and the British Gulliver. Sort of turns the whole story around as a critique of British engagement in South Africa. Colonial dreams, when the war is over, however, may bring great prosperity and the rising sun. You often see the goddess Athena there representing Britain and the Americans. The Chinese kopya, another mixture of the Chinese and the Boer War imagery. Kopya meaning the hill in South Africa where the battles were fought, but here it's the Chinese question. The Chinese kopya, not so easy as it looked from a distance. Will the foreign powers after 1900 get entangled and bound down into the mysteries and entanglements and chaos of China, just the way the British have got themselves entangled in South Africa. Colonial quagmire in both cases, as it were. Who is the barbarian from a French point of view? This is one of my favorites from a French critical magazine. Which is barbarity and which is civilisation? If a Chinese coolie strikes a French soldier, people cry barbarity. When a French soldier strikes a coolie, it's a necessary blow for civilization. And finally, my old-time favorite by this very brilliant German illustrator for this satirical magazine, Simplicissimus, that was published in Germany, people who detested Kaiser Wilhelm and the imperialist rhetoric of the time, has this brilliant imagery. The Europeans pour the blessings of their culture over the world. You have the jackbooted soldier, that cornucopia of prosperity, dumping blood and tromping exactly on Indochina and China right here. So the anti-imperialist imagery also mobilizes many of the same imagery as the imperialists do. And finally, Victor Gillam, one of the brilliant illustrators for this journal, portrays this massive slaughter and all the wars that are happening around this time. Transvaal, Philippines, Austria, Franco-Prussian, and says, think about it, is civilization advancing? Chinese immigrants, one to flip the story back briefly and then try to finish up, in the US faced many of these same attitudes, and they are unfortunately all too familiar today. They were seen as threats to the economic security of the working class white populations, especially in San Francisco. And people noticed, that this anti-Chinese wall was going up with the Exclusion Acts and the racial laws being passed here, as the US was also breaking down the walls to trade in China. Walls and their paradoxes was part of this discussion at the time. The WASP was really the most offensive, racist journal of the time, published in San Francisco, and very much reflected the attitudes, the anti-Chinese attitudes of that period, with this picture of the multi-armed demonic Chinese god that is somehow has its fingers in everything and is competing with American working men everywhere. It has reached out for trade that it can master, crushes its opposition, crunches out of existence any interest hostile to its monopoly, and so on and so forth. And trigger warning on these. Bubonic plague, so it was called, broke out in San Francisco around 1900, and quarantine measures were imposed, and there are pictures of these sort of dark, confined Chinese cooking under quarantine in these very implied diseased and unhealthy quarters. But even worse, Chinese foodways are portrayed, again, as savage on the left, but the contradiction again appears with capitalism and consumption. On the right, if the Chinese man can be induced to consume this healthy potted meat, cooked beef, well, then America will have civilized the Chinese and turned him into this consumer of American industrial products. Asian voices, that was the European side. I'll quickly run through a few of the Asian voices in illustrations of this period. Chinese were very concerned with the carving of the cake, the carving up of the pie by the imperial powers. They also used this kind of animal imagery a lot in maps at the time. So Chinese see this encroaching imperialist danger coming at them from all sides. Of course, the Russian bear, the American eagle, the French frog, the British tiger, all moving in on the sleeping Chinaman in the center, this is the birth of Chinese nationalism, the idea that the Chinese are asleep and need to be awakened to the imperial danger. This was also portrayed in the Boxer prints of victories of Chinese militia troops against foreign troops. So in the Nianhua Boxer prints, these are Chinese victories, not defeats by foreign armies. Pitched battles are featured, celebrating the victories of the great Qing generals and his Gansu braves over Western forces. These are very idealized versions, but sort of implications that if the Chinese people can be mobilized and can be led properly, they can fight and stand up against Western imperial powers. Holding out at the Dagu forts, shooting down the Western ships. And finally, bring us back to exhibitions quickly. Yang Qichao, the greatest political writer of the time, one of the founders of the Chinese nationalist ideology, writes these remarkable things in a form of science fiction at the time, which flourished greatly among Chinese writers at the time. Jules Verne, the great French science fantasy writer who had published 5 Weeks in a Balloon in 1863, Around the World in 80 Days in 1873, he was translated into Chinese and widely read around this time. And Chinese have lots of pictures of balloons and their potential both for military and travel experiences. They imagine people flying to the moon. And Bao Yu, the hero of the great Chinese Dream of the Red Chamber story, in one of these fantasies, wakes up 150 years later and travels around the world in a great balloon that's been created by Chinese. Goes to Shanghai. He finds that the city has become a major metropolis. China has a constitutional government. It's eliminated the extraterritorial rights of foreigners, and it is now holding a World's Fair attended by many nations and a World Peace Summit. And the nations of the world have selected the Chinese emperor to be its chair. And the new civilized world will be ruled by an updated version of Confucian benevolence. Then Bao Yu wakes up and discovers this was all a dream, of course. But of course, this fantasy reappears in a sketch by Yang Qichao, mimicking this utopian novel of Edward Bellamy called Looking Backwards, where after 2,500 years after the birth of Confucius at a world exposition, thousands of people from around the world have now recognized the great advances of China. They have learned Chinese. They've gathered to hear lectures on the new political philosophy and the cultural advances that have occurred in the 60 years since 1902. And well, Yang Qichao's dream is here, isn't it, in Chinese eyes? The Chinese Pavilion, the great Shanghai Exposition of 2010, which covered 1,300 acres, had 246 countries and international organizations, and 73 million people attending, outstripping the Paris exhibition. So we come back to this world expedition idea of technological and cultural wonders, but now China at the center instead of China at the nadir, as it was in 1900. But once more back to the dark side and the awakening of China and how it was seen as a threat around 1900, a threat over these victorious powers, even though they've defeated China. China, they know or predict, will once again awake and take its revenge or take its place in the world. And finally, the most ominous picture of the time are the great imperial powers, the animals, the British here, the Russians, the Japanese jackal, the American eagle, Germany in the back, clustered around the dead Chinese dragon with the Q, saying the real trouble will come with the wake. The wake is, of course, a play on words. It's the Irish term for a funeral, but it also invokes the future awakening of China and imperial geopolitical conflict. So this gives us, from the year 1901, a kind of ironic and troubling commentary on what was to come in the new century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Our discussion is Wenxin Ye, the Richard H. and Laurie C. Morrison Professor of Chinese History at Berkeley.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that this is a very big paper. And then also, it's a wonderful paper. It's simply pure pleasure to follow Peter's presentation. So my chore then is an easy one, namely that I would make a couple of observations, sharing with you my observation about the way that he puts the paper together. And then beyond that, it's entirely up to you That is, you get to have the time to ask him many questions, which I am sure would be forthcoming about the specifics. So this is a big paper about a global moment, which is 1900. So my first observation about this is a project in global history. It's a narrative about the interconnectedness of events across a wide range of sites, Paris and Beijing and elsewhere all around the world. These connections are made on the basis of the movement of people, the circulation of goods and ideas, and the fashioning of new patterns of relationships, large and small, that brought these sites increasingly into relationships, which might be characterized either as mutual dependency or co-production, minimally in conversation. And then the sites connect. It's a modern phenomenon. The sites connect in modern days at an accelerated pace because there were globally shared processes which were mediated by infrastructures of transportation and then also of communication. Meanwhile, of course, culture, history, language, local politics, etc., all of those continue to matter. So there were, as Peter puts it, entanglements of local circumstances within the context of these processes of global connection. So in some ways, I thought if we are going to dissect the way that he puts the paper together, element number one, this is a global history about a single moment, namely 1900. And then about 1900 then, how does he present this moment? Well, in this paper, he uses a wealth of visual materials collected from global media to tell this story of global connections at a given moment in a global time. Now, images travel through means such as telegraphs, trains, ships, in printed forms, as books, as photographs, as posters, so on and so forth. They go with Liang Qizhao, they get carried along in somebody's pocket, they travel. And then these images were mass produced by and large. They involve the use of things such as camera and printing press, and then also their production was buttressed by industry and technology for the production as well as the distribution of such images. So in other words, we are talking about the global phenomenon, as Peter puts it, global media of global print culture, which has a pronounced visual dimension. And then the production and the consumption of these images as they circulated out of the immediate contexts of their production, or as they become detached from the sources of production, they contributed to the synergistic co-production of new images at sites, right, from which they were detached. And these processes of reading and reproduction open up many interpretive opportunities and certainly opportunities for engagement, for conversation, for talking back, for redistribution, you name it, whatever that reading and reproduction would do. So that's my observation number two, namely this is a project put together on the basis of a very sophisticated appreciation of global media and the whole phenomenon of visual culture. The third point here is, I think it's the argument of this paper, namely, what is this moment, 1900? So 1900 is a moment then, that is between Paris and Beijing. This is a moment when efforts were made to define civilization and barbarism, to differentiate between enlightenment and backwardness, to deploy such constructions in the context of the deployment of means of violence and coercion. In other words, these are not innocent terms, neither innocent constructions. So at sites such as Paris or Beijing, images and categories were embedded and deployed in contexts and structures which were hierarchical. Local structures such as nation states or capitalist system of industrial society, in other words, they have their internal structures of hierarchy of those between the capitalists and the workers, between the aristocracy and people on the street, and so forth. So with tools such as comparison, contrast, and juxtaposition of things across space, by looking both at local entanglements and at globally shared processes, Professor Perdue finds ways to destabilize the hierarchy that is grounded in local circumstances. So by elevating the visibility of the globally shared processes, and by stressing the simultaneity and the interconnectedness of the localized articulations, we find a way to dislodge the latter from its localized hierarchy. So, as in this paper, we then open up a venue to question locally established constructs, such as barbarism versus civilization, or the barbarian versus the civilized. And then he gives us several examples of paradoxical usages of means of confinement versus means of mobility. That is, things such as walls and fences on the one hand versus palaces of light, roads of connection, 80 days around the world in a balloon, Jia Baoyu's fantasy flight into realms beyond imagination. So these are, he played up the contrasts as well as the paradoxical deployment of these devices. And then what purpose does this serve? Well, these are usages or paradoxical usages of means and confinement and mobility contributing to the paradoxical usage of power and technology on the one hand, and the deployment of arguments about morality and ethics on the other. So, all in all, those were my observations about how he puts the paper together, and what is the benefit then of reading historical moments the way that he does within the context of the global. Well, obviously, it contributes to the destabilization of local frameworks of interpretation. That is, it contributes to the destabilization of local structures which are implicitly hierarchical, rooted in the past, and, shall we say, hegemonic of its own sort. And then at the same time, another benefit coming out of this approach, it seems to me, is that it contributes to a better understanding of the broader patterns of human events, especially in late modern times of advanced technology and organization of communication and transportation. In other words, after all, as humankind become more and more connected with each other, it's about time for us to ask this question. Is there a human story for us to tell above and beyond the localized, embedded ones about systems of political economy or systems of nation state? So those are some of my observations and reflections. I thought I'd take this as an opportunity to share them with you. And I very much appreciated and enjoyed this wonderful paper. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the very nice comments, Wenxin. I don't feel I need to respond right now. If others have questions, I'd be happy to answer them, or else. Yes. Hi.
Thank you, Peter. This is wonderful. Just a very quick question. I love these images. I think they are really telling a lot of stories. But I wonder if you spend some energy or time on the audience side, right? So who are, or the producer's side, right? So who are producing? But some are the matchboxes, some are really commercial advertisements, other are political satire, magazines. I would imagine the imagined audience for these two types of images probably are not the same, right? And then the people who produce them also probably are not, in the same category of, cultural production. So I would like to hear if, what should we think about those categories?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I could look into that a lot more, but broadly speaking, I think my impression is particularly looking at the American imagery, that they overlap a lot. It really is. If you look at the trade cards, there's been quite a bit of research on American trade cards anyway, and on the political journals, that the imagery in them is very similar. Certainly the racism against Chinese is quite similar, and the duality of the Chinese both as being a kind of alien savage on the one hand, but also an eager consumer on the other. That is really shared by both the political cartoons. The whole discussion about colonialism in America, I think, and the takeover of the Philippines in particular is really polarized around this same issue. If the US becomes an empire, it will be ruling foreign alien peoples, and that may compromise the purity of its ideals. But on the other hand, this will create new products and new consumers. So it is also portrayed as a way of extending American prosperity. And the same is true with the commercial trade card. So at least in the US, I think that's why, but compared to the written word, you could say that most of the written texts certainly are aimed at a literate elite. But the visual record, I think, is very blurred. I mean, it can appeal to all sorts of levels and maybe shared among many different classes. Yes?
I wish my teacher, Joseph Levinson.
Oh, you knew Joseph Levinson, did you?
Ask you a question.
Oh, yeah.
I have a question about this historiography, and it's almost an unfair one. Is there a central question that this is designed to answer? I mean, it's a beautiful historiography because you link together so many different things. As Professor Ye said, the topic is gigantic. I mean, state politics, arts, technology, morals, anarchists, wealth and inequality, racism. We heard Kurt Weill and we heard an Erhu. And we saw wonderful visuals. You give us a 1900 zeitgeist that was somewhat altered by the terrible war of 1914 plus. I think of other historiographies, Karl Schorsky, also previously of Berkeley and other places, wrote his book on Fantasy Act of Vienna, and he linked the substantive material that he had from there to historiography, and especially a few more psychological factors.
Yeah.
In a nice way, though dealing with urban planning and arts and the same range of topics really that you did. In your material, is there also a sort of a general substantive, not just methodological topic? And is it, this is a question, I really don't know the answer, is it really the rise of violent nationalism in an age when Western powers, for technological reasons, imposed terrible imperialisms on lots of countries and tried to, and were violent against each other too? Have I got that right? To some extent, these problems since 1900 still exist. Is part of your question, how can we do better now? Or is that beyond the job of an historian?
Yeah. Thanks for all of that. Yeah. Well, I'm very inspired by Karl Schorsky, but I am no Karl Schorsky, to be sure. And I think he did a brilliant job in his book on Fantasy Act of Vienna. And somehow I have to bring Vienna into this story just because it's such a fascinating place. There may be a Chinese angle to it, but part of my, I guess, general thinking is we have these great kind of cultural interconnections being developed for Europe, and they are still Eurocentric. Asia plays a major role in all of this, and that has really been neglected to a certain extent. So to just partly do a similar strategy for a world that takes Asia seriously, that's part of the goal. Though it does, I think, has to respond to the consciousness of rise of China today. I mean, that is something that was not in Schorsky and other people's work at the time. Nobody imagined the China that we have today and the issues that it raises for world power and world commerce. Well, I think, what you say about racism, nationalism, and violence is not going away. I think we unfortunately know that. I think historians in general, well, if we don't want to predict the future, we do have, anyway, some bad news and some good news to hold people. The bad news is this stuff has happened before. It's part of the human condition. It's unlikely that it's going to disappear. That's the bad side of our story. But then the good side of the story might be, well, it happened in certain ways, in certain places back at that time, and if we try to do things a little bit differently, maybe it won't be as bad this time, this time around. I always have this feeling, looking at this really offensive, open, racist writing of the time, of the 1900s, and I do believe we can't ignore it, we can't suppress it, we can't evade it. This is offensive in every respect, but we hope, even though it exists today, that it receives more criticism today and more opposition than it used to back in the past. But I like to highlight, contradictions and dichotomies rather than just make one simple story. So there were critics of imperialism. Mark Twain was one of the great critics of American imperialism, of course. There were other people, like the German writers, who were opposed to all of this, and they were in a dialogue with the pro-imperialists, pro-racists of their time, and we have the same dialogue today, but different in certain ways. When people talk about media, also, I think we should get a perspective on modern media. If you want to blame everything on modern social media, well, the social media of the time were these illustrated newspapers, the tabloids, and all of these things, and they were producing many similar effects back then. There was no golden age, as it were. Yes?
I have an offbeat question, and I'll ask the question, and I'll explain why I ask it. My question is, were you at one time a scientist?
Oh, I'm flattered that you might ask. No.
Okay, and my reason for asking it is that for years, for decades, as I taught here, I wondered why some students had a great deal of difficulty understanding science or technology, mathematics, what we call the STEM. And finally, after I retired, I moved into a dorm and started living with students who were not scientists. And and then I realized that in the sciences, everybody in the sciences, or what we call the STEM, thinks visually. It's absolutely essential for anybody who wants to master the sciences or mathematics or technology, have to do visual thinking. And what I've seen you present to us, I was astonished. I would call it a scientific lecture, because you've used visual images to give us a kind of texture and depth of understanding, very much the same way a scientist uses visual models to create some sort of models of the universe. And I'm just amazed and astonished at this lecture, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Frankly, I did study science in college way back, and at that time there was very little visualization, I can tell you. That was before the days of computers and data visualization. Things were written out in equations, you know. So I think a big change has occurred, and actually that allows for convergence between humanities' visually oriented, certainly, types of humanistic discourse and scientific visualization. Yes.
Just one comment. There was visualization, but nobody ever told the students.
I guess not.
It was
I guess
my
not.
fault. I taught for decades. And I never told the students, you absolutely have to think in pictures or you cannot master the STEM.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Great. Yeah. Okay.
I have the
Yes.
mic. Could I? Sorry.
Oh, you're in the back. Sorry.
Can I,
Yes. Go
since
ahead.
I have the mic, ask a question? The images of the Boxer Rebellion made me think about the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship,
Oh, yes.
whereby about 1,300 Chinese scholars studied in the U.S. from 1909 to 1929.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious if there's any kind of visual record, you know, of this educational cultural exchange that was really the first of its kind in a really massive and systematic and significant way to potentially break down all of these stereotypes of, you know, of these two cultures, nationalities, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just curious if there were, how widespread that was known in either American or Chinese visual culture, and if there's any record and documentation of that.
Yeah. Well, really, Wen Xin is much more of an expert on this sort of thing. At Yale, of course, it wasn't the first time the Chinese had come to the U.S. At Yale, we always like to refer to the well-known Yung Wing, you know, who came as part of a group of Chinese students early on. And from the 19th century forward, there were many other cultural exchanges at the academic level and student level. So the U.S., I think, saw itself as continuing on this tradition, unlike, say, the Japanese, who invested their Boxer indemnity in further industry and military growth. So that we said, we invested ours in education. As a matter of fact, many more Chinese went to Japan than actually came to the U.S., so we weren't unique in this respect. But there are certainly studies and photographs and other records of universities that certainly could be used to give us more of a visual picture of these students and how they were affected by the foreign experience. Yeah. Hi.
Yeah, this is sort of a broader question, but in terms of this idea of light and dark and hierarchies, it seems to me it might have a relevance. But in discussions of racism, not just in your talk, but broadly speaking, it seems to me there's a failure to make a very important distinction between racism in the sense of having very negative beliefs about another racial or ethnic group versus racism in the sense that one cultural universal is that parents always discriminate in favor of their children, and of course their relatives and their friends in their tribe. So it seems to me the real challenge in the world is how do ethnic groups or groups of any kind find a way to share wealth that seems acceptably just to each other so they can avoid a self-destructive war. But by failing to clearly distinguish ethnic conflict from racism in the sense of negative beliefs about it, is that it avoids the real problem, because when it comes to negative beliefs about other people, well, when you get to know people in another racial or ethnic group, you find they're really good people, and so that's a solvable problem. But the other one, I'm not sure is solvable, but we might muddle through.
I see. Well, what could a historian say about these sort of generic human tendencies? Certainly the tendency to prefer the family over the wider community is something that, say, Confucius and the Chinese political theorists were quite aware of, and they built a society on the idea of the family as the primary goal. Opponents of Confucius, like the Mohists and others, however, espoused ideas of universal love, and somehow you should embrace your understanding, your moral understanding beyond your own family and treat others like yourself. Mohists are often cited by Christians as sort of the origin of the idea of treating others all equally. In the Christian ideal, at any rate, the people are all supposed to be treated equal. In fact, in practice, they aren't. But what you raise is clearly a crucial issue. How do you get people who will naturally be loyal to their own ethnic, familial, and a nation, if it's built on this sort of familial principle, to be loyal to that personal familial unit without looking down on others who are equally loyal to their personal finish? I think that was, perhaps we could give Okakuro Tenshin credit for, and the Pan-Asianists of that time, Tagore and others, for announcing these kind of ideals. But who would really be more convincing, Okakura or Kotoku? Is it going to lead to violent conflict or peace? Well, the historical record is mixed. Yes.
Really, thank you for the talk. I was wondering, when you were doing the research, did you get a sense of how, there we go. Did you get this? I mean, when we talk about 1900s, also the first year of the 20th century, and when you were doing the research, did you get a sense of how maybe the Chinese or the Japanese intelligentsia, did they begin to share that kind of sort of expectations that we see often sort of in European writings? When you get to the first year of the new century, you have that sort of large warp of writing about expectations, predictions, etc. Do you see that sort of similar sort of things going on for parts of non-European settings?
Mm-hmm. So maybe Europeans, it's often characterized for European thinkers as fin de siècle. They had a consciousness of this being the end of a century and becoming a turning point in our minds. Did the Chinese have a similar fin de siècle sort of feeling about these? Well, I think they really did think there was an existential threat to Chinese civilization by this point. From the Sino-Japanese War forward, it was not just a foreign defeat, not just a penetration of markets, not just violence against some Chinese, but really they feared the end of China entirely as a civilization that could survive in the world. They had picked up the same Western discourse. They had used Darwinism, social Darwinism, and the struggle of the fittest, and they were using this as a way to awaken China, to awaken a sleeping China. So in that sense, they had this same kind of shared idea, which again would be worth tracing. French had a very similar idea in that way, that the French nation, they felt, was being weakened, was being decadent, was being softened. Americans, well, there are Americans, I have to say, who felt that the white race was being weakened by the influx of immigrants. This is a very common discourse of the time among very distinguished people in the American elite. So there are many ways of using this sort of discourse of fin de siècle in different ways, of course. Hi, yeah.
You mentioned that Okakura Tenshin talked about the romanticism of the social order, and the word romanticism caught my attention. I just wondered what you think he might have meant by using romanticism in that way.
Well, I suppose he's not my favorite writer, and he's not noted for his clarity. He does use a lot of sort of grandiloquent phrases, which actually, I'm afraid, don't sound any better in Japanese than in English. But he was equally fluent in both languages, and he knew what he was doing. I mean, this was a kind of discourse, a rhetoric that appealed to people at the time. So what is the romanticism of the social order? Yeah. Well, probably he has the idea, I guess, that the great religions of Asia create an emotional commitment, a spirituality that leads people to be fundamentally attached to their particular version of civilization, and this is what creates a great social order, a great solidarity and cultural achievement. And to give him fair credit, he puts Japan and China and India on more or less the same level, that the Indian civilization is in its own way just as powerful and important as Chinese and Japanese civilization are. So probably he's referring to something like that sort of spiritual commitment, which was extremely attractive to, say, the Boston Brahmin elite in the Northeast. He was a close friend of Isabella Stewart Gardner, for example, in the aesthetic circles, including Henry James and others, that admired this kind of Japanese aesthetic approach to society.
A different subject that maybe appears in your book, and that is the women's movement. Certainly in England, America, Russia, the advancement of women was very, very important. And you mentioned the appearance of these elegant stores for women, but there are lots of other stories. In England, women were agitating to get into the best colleges, to go to law school, medical school, and so on. And I don't know whether that appears in your book or...
It will have to, yes. I haven't developed the gender aspect very much. But, well, we've been doing a seminar, my colleague Jing Zhu in literature and I at Yale about these years. And early feminist writings are actually also date from this period in journals. And people have kind of rediscovered and translated some of the first women radical activist writers of the time. At the same time, missionary schools have also been admitting women, in fact, to education within China around the same time. And in Japan, there's a much more active and even more radical women's movement going on. The Russian populists, you may know, featured some important women. Sophia Petrovna, was it, who was part of the assassination plot. And the name Sophia actually becomes a popular name in China as a kind of imitation of her model as a radical Russian feminist. So there are many other interesting threads there that we could follow up. Yes, hi.
All right, thank you for sharing this wonderful project with us. And I have a question about the methods, this kind of panoramic overview of this historical moment. And I was thinking about Professor Ye's word, dislodging, and I think it's a kind of a double-edged sword, if you may think that way. It's liberating because you can dismantle the local hierarchies. But on the other hand, there's probably a price to pay as well, right? And another earlier question mentioned the visual sources that you're using too. They're agencies in the production and consumption, and also different medium are the kind of material you used in this project, and then you have to do a dislodging in that sense as well. So I just want to ask you the question, what are the prices that you think you paid, and do you think it's worth it?
Yes, good. Well, to begin at the end, yes, it's worth it in my mind. But there is a price to be paid in the sense that we lose a simple coherence of a national narrative. So that is what it's still true, most historians are most comfortable with, and certainly the public, when it mostly thinks about history, thinks it about as a national history that has a sort of clear boundaries that tells the growth of a nation in sort of the form of the growth of a human individual, a biography of a nation, as it were. That's certainly a very familiar and comfortable way of telling. And there's nothing wrong with the narrative. It's engaging and informative, but doesn't reflect everything that goes on in the world. So once you dislodge that and look for other trends that go beyond the nation state, I believe we're sort of like in the uncomfortable but exciting position of modernist literature, which also really dates from the early 20th century, that was dislodging the more comfortably inherited narratives of the novel, say, and dissolving it into, say, Joycean style or Proustian styles that flow all around in many different directions. The danger is you could lapse into a complete incoherence, of course, and just have nothing but random events. That's one danger. The danger with visual materials is something also that's it's also new for for most historians. We are much more comfortable with text than with visual materials. And visuals have their own interpretive issues, and they strike people emotionally more than rationally, I think. So we can sometimes tease out the rational content, but not so easily the emotional content of the visuals. So in both cases, it kind of does upset things, but I think generates new ways and new insights in the end that make the cost worth it.
The nationalist narrative is not the only narrative you have. There's much. There's microhistory. There's local as well.
Yes, okay. Well, those I don't see as, contradictory. I mean, you can tell a local history that is also deeply entangled and embedded with larger transnational histories. The microhistories I like best, if you know this field of microhistories, Robert Darnton's work on France, is actually not just about, say, a cat massacre in one factory. It's all about French history as a whole, kind of as one event representing the larger whole. That's what I think the best microhistories do. You can have a microhistory that doesn't just represent a national culture, but a global, more transnational, international culture in a similar way, I think. So I think those could be seen. Local and small scale can be seen is compatible. The global is in the local, likewise the local is in the global, for example. Yes, on the left. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for such a great talk. Last year, your colleague Denise Ho visited us to talk about her book, Curating Revolution, and somewhat inspired by her, I wanted to ask about the expositions. To us in the present, they seem like very clear symbols of the contradictions between opulence and the subjugated peoples outside of the European metropole. But do you think that to the contemporary curators and visitors, those contradictions were also somewhat clear or starting to emerge? And did that fuel some of the other developments that you talked about in your speech?
Yeah, well, I've gone through some of the critical debate around the French exposition by French writers at the time. So there is a giant 6-volume official report by Monsieur Picard, which the Beinecke Library in Yale holds one of the few copies of it, and that gives you sort of the official overview of the entire planning of the exhibit. And on the other side, you have the contemporary press and writers and others and visitors who express different points of view from this meticulously planned kind of bureaucratic style. They find one of the complaints is, one of the issues is, will the exhibition make money or not? This is true for every World's Fair, actually, an issue for all of them. So the people who want to charge prices to the visitors to make money off it are the commercial exhibitors, of course, who are expected to contribute to it. But the others who object will say, but then the poor, ordinary citizens won't have access to this. Is this really intended for the ordinary people? Is this just a celebration of wealth for international and national elites? And then others who will say, all this money and attention being paid to the glittering palaces has completely diverted attention away from the miserable slums and the urban development that the city really needs. The same arguments were made about the Beijing Olympics, you might recall. The critics of the Olympics in Beijing say it had taken away from attention to local urban development. So I think these critiques are still apparent at the time.
I wanted to share in the 1915 International Exhibition, the PPIE, here in San Francisco, that the exhibit on China and Chinatown was actually an opium den where they had all the stereotypes and put real people in with wax figures and the rats and the opium pipes and opium balls. And the local Chinatown leaders wrote a protest letter, which was exhibited at Chinese Historical Society here. And they built a pagoda, which the visitors weren't interested in. They wanted to go to the opium den. So since that is such a strong stereotype that was established in the turn of the century, I would like to point out, as a Yale alumna of the first class of girls, it was Harvard. Harvard was the base for scientific racism and produced the eugenics studies with the diagrams and the books of the skulls and the brains and the shapes of your head. And so, we've come a little bit of a way since then, but those attitudes were also documented in Ron Takaki's work about the iron cages, how the U.S. Navy went across the Pacific. And, it was the white man's burden to civilize these little brown yellow men, in the Pacific and in Asia. And, those things still kind of cling onto us. And I think until we raise a generation, maybe the millennials, right, have broken through that, where we can have more equal interactions. But I think the value of your work is to bring out all those political cartoons. Phil Choi had a book, The Coming Man. The Filipinos have a book, The Forbidden Race. And we're still living with some of that paternalism.
Yes, thank you for that. No, I mean, I really appreciate a lot of what Asian American historians have done to expose all of this. And what I only was trying to do here is to link that a little bit more with the larger international processes. It wasn't just an American phenomenon in many ways. Also, I'm sorry to say that Yale is also complicit in some other ways. A fascinating person I'd like to look into more is Ellsworth Huntington, who was a geographer, traveler, historian, who I think chair of geography department at Yale, who traveled to China and Central Asia many times and espoused a kind of environmental determinism with racism combined that in some ways still shadows the field of environmental history. The idea that, say, the aridity of Central Asia caused the nomads to become violent and invasive, and that this was an essential character, say, of the nomads, and the environment of China made people docile and so forth. These sort of crude generalizations about how climate is connected to racial character. So that was, I have to say, a Yale. Louis Agassiz at Harvard was, yes, not, has a lot of blame to take too, but it wasn't just Harvard, I'm afraid. Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you also to Wen Shin for being with us.